Alrighty, so I think this is going. Yeah, just wanted to thank everyone for joining us in this discussion today. I'm Bill Monkman. I'm the chief architect at Commit, and yeah, welcome to our developer relations panel. So we are going to be looking for a developer advocate for our open source project called Zero. I'll plug the link for that below. As part of that, we really wanted to get advice and input from a lot of people who are experts in that role. And I think there's still a lot of mystery around this type of role. It's still relatively new in our industry. But we really believe in working out loud, and we thought that this knowledge could be useful to a lot of other people as well. So we figured that if we're going to be having these discussions already, why not open it up so that other people can learn from these people. So please ask questions in the YouTube and LinkedIn comments if you have them. There will be a Q&A portion at the end. And I wanted to give some shout outs to everyone at Commit for sort of supporting this, especially to my good friend Mishra for organizing an amazing group of speakers and for moderating the discussion today. And a big thanks to all of our panelists for making the time for us today. So I will hand it over to Mishra to introduce everyone.
Hello, everyone. My name is Mishra. I'm the technical advisor to the CTO at HashiCorp. I work in the office of the CTO at HashiCorp on strategic initiatives. These might be, internal initiatives, some of the open source external initiatives with our, main partners like AWS, Google. I'm a computer engineer by trade. I studied computer engineering. I did software engineering. And then operations engineering. So I kind of understand both sides of software delivery and empathize with both the software developer and operations person. Before my role, actually, as a technical advisor, I worked as a developer advocate. So I led our developer advocacy team at HashiCorp for about 2 years. And these 2 years, I learned a lot about open source and how we build software in software communities today. But more importantly, I met a bunch of really amazing and talented folks in the OSS community, and they became my friends. And I'm really excited to moderate today's developer relations panel with these people who are really the kind of the experts in this. We can start introducing people. So I think let's, I'll have Rosemary join first if we can in the show. There we go. Rosemary, could you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Mishra. I'm Rosemary Wang. I'm a developer advocate at HashiCorp. I did work with Mishra. I still work with Mishra, so it's great. And I've had a tenure in open source for, I would say, 5 years from the first time I opened my first open source PR. I'm sad to say it was never merged. And there was, but it taught me a great lesson, right? And so over the years, I've spent a lot of time building infrastructure automation in different spaces. It went from like Open vSwitch all the way to today, Terraform, Kubernetes, and many other tools. And I was previously an electrical engineer who sort of fell into the cloud computing space and tried to become a really good software developer, but found out I was kind of not the greatest software developer. And so I'm always learning, and that's what the powerful part of the open source community is for me. And that's being able to contribute what I've learned, but also learn from others and improve my own skill set.
Absolutely. I think it's so interesting, like moving from like a more like electrical engineering background into cloud. Like I would love to learn more about it. Hopefully we can talk about it in the panel as well. Okay, let's have Cody next on the show. Cody, thanks, please introduce yourself.
Hey, yeah, totally. Thanks, Mishra, for having me. So my name's Cody Arkland. I work for Kong. I also work in the office of the CTO, just a member of the technical staff. I float around between a bunch of things, helping us do more strategic things. Right now, focused heavily on the service mesh space. I always joke a lot about like the idea of being like accidentally here because I didn't come from a traditional like software development background. I came from kind of the enterprise space and working pretty heavily in the enterprise. And my kind of gateway into like the relations world came through the community. And I've spent a lot of time working in the community. I attribute most of my career opportunities to good relationships in the community. So I joke that I'm accidentally here. Somehow I managed to end up with all these really cool, really smart people who who signed me into the club. So I'm here now.
Yeah, if you're on Twitter, like you definitely have seen Cody, out Cody's post somewhere about like presenting or working with a certain community. So he's really a famous person on Twitter. All right, let's have Karen next to join us. Cool, Karen, please introduce yourself.
Hey, so I'm Karen, and I am a community manager at Microsoft Azure. And so I guess I've been working in open source for almost 6 years now. And I was actually at a startup that just did open source tooling, and then we got acquired by Microsoft. So I guess like I did kind of start in this space doing community marketing for open source tools. And then from there, I've kind of grown into more of like a community focused role. So I currently report into like product management, but I work really closely with our engineers and our PMs and, marketing, PR, and like the CNCF a ton as well. So yeah, that's kind of my background in the space. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I mean, it's a funny story. Karen and I met at, I think, DevOps Days Portland, and Karen was with, I think, the Helm project or something like that.
Yeah, I'm currently in Portland, actually.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, I'm working remotely. So yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, so it was nice. It led to me contributing to Helm. So thanks for all your work, Karen. Okay, next up, I think Daniel. All right. Cool. Hopefully, there we go.
Hey, everyone. Good to see you. Good to see you again. So, Daniel Bryant, Director of DevRel at Ambassador Labs. Showing my age a little bit, but my open source career goes back to SourceForge. I was working in academia, contributing lots of stuff to SourceForge. I think it's still around, but I don't go there that often now. We go to GitHub more, right? But my real deep dive into open source came when I got involved in the OpenJDK. So my background, my native language, I joke, is Java. I've coded in many things over the years, but some of my dearest mentors to my heart, some of the folks that gave me the most opportunities were in the Java space. So the London Java community, I'm based just outside of London. They opened so many doors for me. And one of the key things that I wanted to do is how can I pay that forward? So they said, get involved with open source, get involved with the OpenJDK. And that's where I learned a lot. And then moving on from Java to a bit more Opsy stuff, that's where you and I crossed paths, Mishra, when I was doing some stuff with Terraform and firm favorite of mine at the time was Vagrant. So I migrated from Vagrant to Console to Terraform. And then the story, I never worked at HashiCorp, but like I feel like I have sometimes. Right? I love the brand so much. I'm usually rocking HashiCorp swag and loving the open source vibes. But good to see everyone.
Cool. Yeah, it means I think it's so. Yeah, again, I think I met Daniel at an open source conference as well. It's really, really amazing how many people you've met during this. During this like even short period of time, right? Even though we can't meet each other anymore because of COVID, but this is the best we have, and we'll try to make the most of it. So, okay, I'll kick off the discussion. We're here to talk about developer relations, developer advocacy, building open source communities. Kind of demystify some of the kind of the hype behind this, this whole, I guess a vertical of, roles and, jobs, and just like the kind of the gist of what it is, right? So I think I'll start like in terms of like being a developer advocate or being in developer relations, it's really to kind of cultivate that trust, both on the product side and kind of the developer side, and then use that to maybe influence, roadmaps and influence decision-making for the product and kind of complete that feedback loop. And I think when I was diving into it, moving from operations engineering to becoming a developer advocate, I read I think it was Ashley McNamara's, blog post, which was about what is a developer advocate. And she was joining Microsoft Azure at that time. And Ashley's, of course, one of my idols as well. And, reading that through, and she said something really interesting. She said that there were quite a lot of people that are focused on creating, awesome software, but there's very few people that are focused on enabling people to use that. And I think it still holds true, even though I think developer relations has progressed quite a lot in the past years, and there's more open source communities and so on. It's still, we still need more people doing this and helping people. So I'll have the first question to the panel, which is, what is developer relations or developer advocacy? How do you define it? I know there's so many different definitions, so let's see the ones that we come up with. Let's start off with Daniel.
Thanks, Mishra. Yeah, it's one of those things like, even DevOps, right? It means many things to many people. But for me, I often say to my team, it's like being the ears, the voice, and the hands of the community, right? We listen in, what's going on, what's your problems, like what's your troubles, like in the general space as much as with our tools. But then we're also the voice giving advice back, the voice internally to our teams, relaying information from the community. And when I say the hands, it's kind of like showing people the way, right? I always really enjoy that teaching thing. Like from a kid at a very early age, I love building stuff, but helping people to build was even more fun. Yeah. So I think that's the folks I see that do really well in DevRel. I think sort of have those kind of skills around wanting to bring people along on the journey. I think that's so key to DevRel, right? Recognizing the problems, meeting people where they're at, giving them some solutions. That for me is the definition of DevRel, I think.
Cool. Yeah, I think I love the focus on, just the human side of things when it comes to kind of visualizing what DevRel is. Okay, I guess let's go Rosemary. Rosemary, you're next.
I think a lot of developer relations serves as a bit of a proxy group, right? Like sometimes I feel a little bit like the proxy group, someone who's able to say, hey, I'm using this and it's not really fitting with the way I would use it. And the worst thing you can tell to an engineer is that they're wrong, because there are very few technical things that someone can do that are actually truly, like, morally or ethically completely and utterly wrong. So the idea is to be able to say, hey, here's a thing, here's a way of using it, or here's a way that I need to do something, and we need to be able to do it better. And so in developer relations, it's someone who's able to give that cycle. I think Daniel's completely right. You have to have that feedback cycle available. But I actually found by onboarding, we were onboarding someone, but there's actually a great article by Wasim Chegin. It's actually The Subtle Art of Being a Developer Advocate. I think it summarizes a lot of what developer advocacy and developer relations do, right? We have to educate, enable, but also empathize. And it's a great article. I highly recommend anybody read it. Like I think empathy is so critical when it comes to building software today. Like, especially like especially like infrastructure software, I feel like empathy is critical when it comes to building and understanding like how people actually use your software. A lot of companies, like you'll ask the developers, a lot of times they don't use the software that they build, and I think it shows, unfortunately, in certain products and so on. But I think it is getting better, and just because of this role being there, I think that having that influence on the developers and internal teams with an external point of view really helps. I think let's. I'll switch to Cody, and I know Cody has had like a more, I guess, like worked in a more traditional infrastructure company like VMware, like coming into HashiCorp. Like, what have you learned, Cody, about the advocacy world here?
I think it's an interesting thing. I think I agree with everything that Rosemary and Daniel said. I think there's to me, relations ends up being like an empathetic translation layer that ends up working two ways. And that sounds like a really complex way to describe it. But I think that companies internally have an intention of a story they want to tell. And a lot of times that's an outbound story. And they're not always as great at taking what they've put out and then like redigesting the feedback back in on it. And I think that relations people are very good at hearing that feedback and building a good translation, saying, hey, in the community and the people that I'm working with, the people that I'm seeing are actually using this. This is what they took from the way you put it outside, or this is the way that they are trying to use the thing that you created. And if that's your intention, cool. If it's not your intention, we might want to change that and see how we can fix that angle. So I think that there's so much of it, like people who are really successful in this space are very good at taking both the internal intentions and the external perception and creating good translation back and forth between those with empathy, because it's easy to come in and say, whoa, the company meant it this way. This is how you should be using it. But nobody wants that message, and nobody wants to be told this is how you have to use this thing. You're doing it wrong. That's where the empathy comes in, and it becomes like part of being just another human and saying, hey, oh, that makes sense. I see why you want to do this way. Oh, you learned how to use the tool this way, so that's why you keep using it that way. Cool. Understood. Let me take that feedback back in and see if that's the way. How are other people doing that? How are people expecting to consume this versus the way we want? So I think the translation layer is that was how I kind of found my way into this world, was doing those translations and trying to teach my business how to do the things like the vendor wanted to do, but then also how to take those things and feed them back into a community also.
Absolutely. I think that especially critical in a more traditional, product engineering, marketing company where those departments are separate and they don't quite work together in that like hand to hand, and they have a more traditional workflow internally. It means it's even more challenging to do that translation and mapping, because the marketing team wants, you want to present certain things to marketing teams in a different way versus a product team versus an engineering team. So I think, it means you need to be versatile in all three, kind of business units, and it's quite challenging for sure. I would love to learn like Karen's experience, because I always found Karen's job in open source and what I saw like Karen do. Of course, Daniel's, like for example, Daniel's seen Karen like on stage, and we all have seen Karen on stage, delivering keynotes and working in the community. Means how do you kind of how do you measure that when it comes to internal product delivery and so on? So how do you measure what you do in terms of kind of the community person in the company? How do you measure that and make it more relevant like internally? And I think that I've always found it challenging, like how do I measure a success of a developer relations person and then bring that in and put some KPIs on it? Like, how do you do that? I think that's a very interesting part of developer relations.
That is a very complicated question. I don't know if I have a clear answer for that. But I mean, I think one of the things that, like, again, not easily quantifiable, that like I'm currently focusing on is kind of like the health of the projects that I help work on. And so, one thing we're kind of highlighting right now is like getting more maintainers and contributors. And I think like this kind of just speaks to the larger concept of like DevRel, right? Where it's like taking on these tasks that may not necessarily fall in like the PM bucket or the engineering bucket, but it's still work that's really important for like, the overall user experience and just like the health of the project. Like I think there are other aspects like docs and whatnot that just qualifies as work that, again, your engineering teams might be too busy, or just like it's usually outside of their context. And so I think there are things like this that the developer advocate or developer relations team can really focus on that really still do add value. And I think kind of just bringing this back to what Cody was saying earlier, I think like this role brings balance to projects, right? Because they're like, it's your internal, external representative. And again, I think just with my role, I think I am more so focused, maybe less about like the outward, I don't want to say promotion, but like the outward advocacy of your projects. But yeah, there is an internal element to it too, where it's more of like the less flashy stuff. And like I said, like the health of your projects, the sustainability of it, that do still bring value to the project, but they're just not as obvious. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like I think about it as a feeling of an open source project, which is like when you go on the landing page for a GitHub repo, like what do you feel about the project? Because there is first impressions about, of course, how it looks, the README, the GitHub stars, all the vanity metrics that you see. But then does it essentially does that really tell you like whether a project is healthy or not? Right? I think that's another interesting thing that I feel like we should explore. So Karen, what according to you makes that feeling of an open source project being healthy, or open source project being, I guess, active, and people should,
Definitely. Well, I think like our team really likes putting faces to names. So kind of showing up and like providing that human element, which, I think developer relations really value anyway. So I think like, showing up consistently, not like doing things like consistent or like community calls on a cadence, I think is really important, just to show that like you're there, you will continue to be there. The project isn't just going to be dropped or vanish one day. And I think like for me, like I'm really focused on community events. So, I don't necessarily focus on like big ticket I guess, quote unquote, first party events. For me, like I really like showing up to the smaller things that happen on more of a local scale. And yeah, that's kind of how Mishra and I met. So I think that's another element. And then meetups. I really like focusing on kind of the like more intimate settings where, again, you can have that face-to-face conversation and people feel like they can actually have your attention. Because again, I think at the end of the day, it's like knowing the people behind the projects that you're working with really helps provide some validity and confidence in your projects.
Absolutely. There's something to be said about these small communities and the organic way of like, building an open source project. I know so many projects, that I have seen, rise to, success from a really, really, with a really small community. I think one of the good examples is OPA or OPA. I don't know how you name it, like the Open Policy Agent project. I know, like I think it was at the same conference that I met Karen. I met Torin, who is one of the creators, one of the early persons in the project. And Torin, me, and like Kelsey, and I had my open source project, Atlantis, at that time that I was, advocating for, and that ended up becoming, and ended up being part of HashiCorp now and all that. So that was great and great for the project. But I think it was about that smaller group of people that we were like 3 or 4 people. And we were discussing how we can amplify the project, how we can get more eyes on it and stuff. And there's something to be said about those smaller projects where like we see a positive reinforcement from people in the community directly. This is very different from seeing it online or people liking people starring your GitHub repo or something. This is way different. Like when you see someone in person and they tell you how they're using your project or how, you can change the project to be even more successful. I think there's something to be said about that small grassroots like feedback and being able to pivot quickly to getting to a place where like I think it's probably better for you. And you really have to have the humility and like you need to be kind when it comes to that, because I think a lot of people have different ways of giving feedback, and maybe we can get into that as well, and like what you've heard with the craziest stories on feedback that you've heard from the community. So before we get into all that, like I want to really know. Let me take a step back and kind of like learn about like all of you. You're experts at what you do. Like I want to know like how you got there, how you approached getting to the community facing roles, and working in developer relations and so on. So I'll start with Rosemary.
I started because I was working on a team that wasn't really pushing, it really wasn't doing some kind of the new cloud stuff. It wasn't really heavily automated. I came from an enterprise, and I was pretty much the only person who was going out and experimenting with this stuff and breaking it, because the sum total was I got tired of pushing changes on weekends, right, because of change windows. And I was really tired of it. I really wanted to just go out on the weekend. So I'd write scripts, and I didn't want to write some scripts by myself. So then I went down this rabbit hole of open source software, which, by the way, is a big no-no from a security standpoint sometimes. So I went down the rabbit hole and became, in some ways, the team advocate. I was doing a lot of content generation by writing how-tos on how to do all of this stuff to facilitate automation. And it grew from there. And it sort of grew in that I started to take some of the content to get approval to post it outward, outside of the company. And I realized that I enjoyed putting the content out there because it's actually a conversation starter. It's not really someone using it to necessarily educate themselves. It's a way to start a conversation with someone else. And the more content I put out there, the more commentary I got back from different communities, including Kubernetes, many other kind of networking communities who are trying to innovate in the space. And for me, I started to realize, hey, is there even a role that allows me to do this? It turns out developer advocacy is a role. And I started to become more deliberate about it, and that I wanted to be more free in how I contributed back more openly. And also be able to connect the people together who wanted to get things done.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point you made, like starting something internally and doing the inner source first, and like being able to like be successful in your own org and in managing, let's say, a project that's private to your organization, and then trying to think about like going public. And, and I think, and of course, the opposite can be said for like people. There are certain companies that are open source first. They would publicly build a project and be okay with that. And I think, they both have pros and cons, and it's very interesting. All right, so I think let's. I would love to know, like, how Daniel. Like, I think Daniel and I talked about this in one of the podcasts, probably, how Daniel.
Oh, good point, Mishra. Yeah, either your podcast or mine, right? Yeah. Yeah. So my back. So I mentioned earlier, I always loved technology. Always loved building stuff, from like Lego all the way through to coding stuff, and I always loved teaching. So I actually wanted to be a lecturer. So I trained to be a lecturer. Did a PhD, and studied in AI, but it was very theoretical. So my side hustle was coding in Java, and I loved that more, right? But I started doing consulting, but I missed the teaching, right? I was coding and, good friends and good folks, but I missed the teaching. So I started going to meetups. Then I was like, hey, I could, people were super welcoming. Like, they were sharing stuff that, I was super interested in. I thought, yeah, I've got some stuff maybe I contribute. And a few of my now mentors said to me, yeah, everyone's got something to present. Come up on stage. And I can't remember, I talked about some Java tool or something. And I was hooked from that point on, right? I was like, well, I can get on stage, like I can share stuff. It was the missing aspect in my job at the time. And then the two things that really stand out is seeing people, like you say, you teach, you say some things, and then seeing people take it and then just run with it, and that's amazing, right? And the second thing was the friends I've built, and case in point here, right, of people that are like-minded. And by sort of putting your hand up on stage and saying, hey, I love learning, I love Java, I love making mistakes in public, right, and live coding, and then like you connect with kindred spirits. So I always love that kind of networking aspect. So that's kind of like my role was very much into that, looking to connect folks with the teaching. And then, like, to Rosemary's point, like, there's other people that do this. This is a job. I can get paid for this. I was like, from a consulting thing, like, into like more product, and then I went to DevRel, and it's awesome, right?
Absolutely. It means I would love for you to be my professor, Daniel. That would be nice. I love the way you explain things in your talks, and there's always like fun-filled conversation. Like, I've never had, like, usually like professors are very serious, and it's academia-based content is quite dry. But I really enjoy the way Daniel goes about his presentations and so on. So I would love that. And really interesting to know you really like the spotlight on you on stage. A lot of people shy away from it. A lot of people don't want to get on stage and don't want to be on there. But it's good
Introvert
that you
at heart, Mishra, but like on stage, it's like an act, right? You put on like a mask, you do your thing, get off stage, introvert.
Yeah, it's so funny. I think the best speakers that I've met, or I guess I know, they're quite introverted, in their personal lives, for sure. That's a good point. All right, I think this is interesting because I think when I met Cody, and this was, I think, at HashiCorp, like, I've seen Cody speak at other conferences and so on, but it was interesting to know his personality. And Cody is like I think one of the easiest person to talk to, at least like what I met, like in my career, like one of the more interesting and like easiest people to talk to. Cody, I would love to learn how you got to, working in the community and the VMware community.
So first thing I'll say, like, being told I'm easy to talk to is the best compliment I could ever receive. So I sincerely, like, as corny as it sounds, I mean that. Like, I think that one of the best.
I've been paid to say so, but yeah.
I think that empathy is one of those things that everyone appreciates, and I try to do my best to be kind and be empathetic. So I appreciate that. It's a funny journey. So I might get kicked off this panel here in about like 2 seconds, but most of my career has been spent in technical marketing. So like I am the marketing guy. But I've always had a weird approach to it. And full disclosure, it's caused friction in my career, more so for me, not for other people, more so for me in figuring out my identity and who I am. I care very much about the companies I work at being successful, like all of us do. I enjoy writing technical content. All the stuff Daniel said is it was cool because hearing him say, I was like, man, that feels a lot like me. And I just always found my way into technical marketing roles. When I was in my enterprise life before coming over to our side of the world, I was all about taking the things we were building, playing with them in my environment, and then trying to teach other people how to do that. And I fell in love with that process. Like, the problems I was having were problems other people were trying to solve, and the problems I was failing at were things other people were failing at also. So you end up jumping out into this pool of the world and throwing these ideas out there, and you're returned back with all these people who are excited to hear your story, excited to hear your journey on it. They're excited to hear you fail about it because they see the same path they were on, and it's relatable and it's empathetic, and it's a cool thing. And that process became very like exciting for me, and the teaching side of it became very fun, and solving that problem and taking that back to people and watching. I think Daniel mentioned it. Like, there's this interesting moment when you're on stage where you're presenting a concept and you're presenting a story, and then you see people's light bulbs start going off, and they're taking your idea and they're going down their own path with it. And I found that happening when I was a customer and doing presentations, and I fell in love with it. And then I was able to do that in the vendor world, and it was light speed more often, more frequent, in bigger scale. And just that moment when people start having their own ideas is such like an addictive thing to build and tell stories about. It happens in the community, and figuring it out together is a whole different thing that's fun also. So it's a weird path. How I got here is through technical marketing. But I think that anyone who knows me knows that I'm a square peg in that round hole. It's an odd thing.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I think one of the things that you pointed out was the vendor word, right? Like it's really accelerated some of the conversations around building communities and so on. And I think a lot of vendors today, even like the go-to marketing strategy, needs to have a very strong community influence in order to be successful today. Like, that's just the reality now, and wasn't the case, maybe even a few years ago, right? Like, people would build something internally, and all of a sudden there would be a marketing announcement. They would come out with it, and that was it. And then they would promote it in a traditional marketing way. And those days are slowly, going away. I think there's more to like, just building a product, which is to build it, together with a huge bunch of people. And I think this leads me into like segues perfectly into Karen. And for me, the culmination of like who Karen was, like, I think for me personally was when I saw her like keynote KubeCon. And she was, Karen, could you like share some of that experience of how you got there, like from working in the roles that you have, and what was the kind of the keynote? Talk about that one particular keynote that I'm talking about.
Sure. Okay, so what Mishra is referencing is I did a keynote of, I guess it's been like 2 years maybe, where, the origin of the story is my colleague Matt Butcher and I worked on this children's book that explained Kubernetes concepts. And then this was like back when we were still at the startup, and then it like kind of took off a little bit, and then CNCF noticed it, and then as we were getting acquired by Microsoft, they asked like if that was something we were willing to kind of donate to CNCF, because they wanted FIPI to kind of become this like mascot for the foundation. And so we eventually did the donation, and we donated it, and then CNCF then released it under like Creative Commons. So we pretty much open sourced it. Like in the spirit of open source. And then we did a second book, and with that, Matt and I were invited to do a reading of the book as a keynote at a KubeCon conference. I think it was the one in Seattle. And I think that experience kind of I think is a good analogy for my experience with, working in open source, where it was just like, at least for me, I think like working in open source, like I've always, I wasn't doing open source before, this role, and I was doing marketing originally at like a small startup in LA before I joined Deis. And, I started small and, I honestly, like a lot of what I was doing was just like watching what others around me were doing, and working in open source is kind of, at least for me, it's been like a very warm and exciting place where you can try doing different things. And I'm not sure how to explain this. Like, I feel like if you do something, uncool in open source, it kind of like self-corrects, and like you're in the safe space where people will tell you like, hey, like that's not cool, or that is cool. And I think, that whole empathy element really helps provide you with like a space where you can grow and learn how to do open source if you haven't done it before. And I mean, so far, like everyone's been really friendly. I think like recently we had a hiccup, and that is to say, like, it's an onward journey. We're always learning how to like conduct yourself in an open source space. That was like 5 years, or I've been doing this stuff for like 5 years, and there were still like there's still parts for me to grow. And with that, like, yeah, I mean, I guess kind of going back to the book, it's just small things can really take off, which is really exciting. And again, like, I think being an open source, like, you can be anyone and do whatever you want, right? Like, I think it's it can be a level playing field. And like, I wouldn't say that I was necessarily like a standout person in the community, but it's just like something I worked on was cool and it got noticed, and like, it got elevated. And it's just like, I think the work you do, the merit of it will speak for itself. And that's kind of the gist of that story, I want to say.
Absolutely. And, well, Karen, like, let me tell you, a lot of people look up to you today. It's just with that book, I know like a lot of people that with families, like they had their children, read the book, and now they know about Kubernetes at a really younger age. To be honest, I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but they do know about it, and maybe they can, relate to their their parents' job in that way now, because they kind of know some internals of it. So I think it's brought in all the good things in our open source community. And the other thing that you said, which was really interesting, which is having the padding to land on when you do something that's not right, or incorrect in kind of the community sense. I think there's definitely that support in certain communities. Again, we'll have that asterisk on top of that. There's definitely backlash sometimes because it's so, public and everyone knows about it. But I think on the other hand, there's definitely a padding where like people can correct and like come out and say that, hey, like this is not right, and being able to, own up and your mistakes, and then, fix them and move on. And I think that's great about a community. I mean, I think we all kind of know how difficult it is to build software. And how difficult it is to use it, and we are trying to make it easier. So, our intention's definitely right, and sometimes maybe our delivery isn't, but that's okay. I think that we I guess we try the best as we can in this world, in the OSS world. So okay, so now I think we kind of know everyone's experience and past and how they got there. It's super, everyone's very unique story, right? So I want to like kind of give this question out to the panel is what are the key skills that are required to be a really successful? Now, this can be different for different people, right? Like, what are these key skills that are required to be a successful, developer relations function, or a developer advocate, or a developer evangelist in your eyes? And they're quite different, but I think in general, what do you feel like as a human? Like, what are the things that you need? Anyone can take this first.
Shall I go for the first? It'll be really easy to get the first ones right. So we've already mentioned a bunch, like empathy, 100% agree. I think Cody mentioned it, I think we've all mentioned it, right? Empathy is super, super important. And then for me, the connecting bits are being technical, but that means many things to many folks, right? Like technical in terms of like, can you read HTML or like C++ deep dive, depending on what you're advocating for, what you're talking about. And then very closely related to being technical and being empathic is being authentic. Yeah, like, if I don't know something, I would try my best to say, I don't know that. Let me get back to you. Let me ask my team, right? I've seen too many times, and maybe that's the bad side of marketing, where folks are kind of just like, I've definitely worked on teams when I was a developer, when the sales team would sell something we didn't have, and I'd have to build it, right? And that was not a good look. So that's one thing that I really bring into the DevRel space, that is authenticity. Be yourself. We're all on a learning journey here, and you've got to recognize what you're advocating for, what you're doing the DevRel for. You need to understand to a certain level. But yeah, once you've got that technical level, empathy, authenticity, for me, are the key things.
We can go in this order, I guess. Rosemary next, and yeah.
Oh, I see Cody coming off you. Cody, you could go ahead.
I was just to say, I think that Daniel hits a good point there. Is like, technically inclined is important, but I think if you took any of us from this panel and put us in a room with someone who's technically inclined, we can teach them technology, right? If they're interested and they love if they love technology, like, it just takes someone spending a few hours with you to get you into some form of the technology space. If you're technically inclined, that's obviously needed. But I think being a good listener and being willing to hear and being willing to digest even the hard things, the hard moments, and the tough conversations, being willing to be an ear that's able to rise above like the goals of your company or the goals of the project you're working on, and just being willing to say, hey, I'm here to hear what you have to say about this, and I'm here to translate that and try to make your experience better. The ability to hear is such a underrated skill just across a number of industries, but I think especially when you're working with people and you're working with communities, the ability to just sit back and say, hey, give me everything you want to give. I'm willing to hear it and willing to do something about it. Sorry to steal your thunder, Rosemary.
Oh, no problem. I mean, literally, there's empathy, authenticity, being a generative listener. I learned that one a while ago, and that's actually a really powerful concept that I've been able to apply, and it's worked really well, because you want to listen and understand the concerns from a product and engineering standpoint as much as you want to listen to an open source community member's wants and needs as well, and it goes both ways. So being a generative listener overall is really helpful as a skill set. Humility, I think, is sort of, I guess, partners with authenticity, but the humility of saying that this is something you've never come across before, and you're going to help find out the best answer or a better answer than you can give. I think being able to admit that to someone and helping them through the process is actually really important. And finally, something that I never expected and found really important is being creative. People learn different ways. People consume and understand technology in different ways. I have read the Kubernetes book, and it's fantastic. It's a great way. I actually used it to teach my friends a little bit about what I was doing, and they're not technical, right? And so that creativity is really important in developer relations, because so many people have different analogies, different life experiences, and being able to be creative and reach them in different kind of channels is actually the best way that they'll give you feedback about your open source project and also contribute.
Cool. I'll follow up on that. Yeah, I think like just having different communication skills, right? Because like for some people, it might be like visual learning speaks the most to them, or like reading. So like being good at writing like blog posts and things like that is another effective way of communicating, and obviously public speaking. And then another part of all this that I think is important is staying organized. I know that's kind of like, I feel like that's kind of a cheating answer, but yeah, because I think when you work in DevRel, it's really fast paced. Like you're doing a lot of stuff, you're talking to a lot of people, so it can be hard to keep track of everything. And I think, one thing that you can, one way you can be like effective and powerful in your role is like following through on conversations and changes and things like that, right? And so I think when you talk to people, like if you help, like find them the answers that they're looking for, like I think that speaks loudly. And I actually kind of learned this from Cody, who's the community manager at HashiCorp. And like she says that when she talks to people, because she does a lot of networking, and she says that she'll just use her phone and she'll use like in her address book in the notes section, she'll like write down the last thing like she talked to them about. And I think that's like I wasn't doing that before, but I think that's like a really great way to just keep track of the conversations you're having with people, and yeah, kind of like show that you're committed. And so stay organized. Yeah.
For sure, especially in like these mega conferences, you meet like so many people so quickly, and there's like there's there's like contact exchanges, and there's contextual changes in terms of like, especially if let's say you come from a vendor that is doing multiple products or so on, like it's very difficult to keep track of everyone. And absolutely, being organized is very, very important. I can proudly say, I'm still not organized at that, but we still have folks like Karen and Katie that are doing that job, which is amazing. All right, so this is kind of the summing up, and like I think the last question that I want to put up to the panel, and before we open it up to Q&A and so on, is what are the challenges? Talk about some of the cons, talk about some of the challenges that you've faced in the community, maybe and if you can share maybe an experience that taught you a lot about, like, just working through some of these difficult situations that we face in the community. I guess Cody, you can start first since you're unmuted.
Yeah, Mishra knows this about me. I'm not really afraid to like get kind of deep on this kind of stuff. One of the biggest struggles for me has been figuring out who I am in all of this, and I think that there's a box that people occasionally put like the role of DevRel into, and it's things like, you have to have been a software developer before, you have to have development experience before, or have committed X amount of times, and they look at your GitHub repo and understand what your commits are like, or pass the coding test. First off, I failed every coding test that's ever been put in front of me on the first try because I just don't test well. I think that for me, one of the hardest things is understanding, like, I'm in Kong's employee dictionary, my role is technical marketing engineer. That is my job title. But I don't let that stop me from being somebody who cares about developer relations and cares about the community. And I've gotten to a place where I'm confident enough in who I am, not arrogant, still humble, but I know that the value I bring to people around me is my ability to have a conversation and be genuine and be authentic and empathetic. So I can be developer relations and fit that box because it's a broader box than the narrow one. And that's something that when I've talked to other people in DevRel, they've ran into that also at times, where there's a box. Maybe they are heavy software development, but they're not an outward person, or they're not an outspoken person who likes writing blogs or likes doing the stage thing, but they're really good in individual conversations, and they're really good at following up and understanding the dependency tree of everything that goes into DevRel. So they excel at that part of it. I think that understanding that DevRel is a very big box and that people fit into different parts of that box, and you're not always going to find people who agree with that, but you have to know that about yourself in your heart as part of your own journey going through kind of this thing of careers. So I got super deep on that one, but it's Mishra knows from a lot of mentorship conversations that he and I have had. This has been a struggle that I've had since early days at VMware at HashiCorp. I mean, Mishra and Rosemary both have had conversations with me about me trying to work through this and find my way on it. So.
Absolutely. I often forget that how big developer relations is. Like, sometimes if you meet like 10 people that do the same thing and they have the same roles and responsibilities, you somehow mold your thinking into, just thinking that, hey, this is what developer relations is. But I think the function itself is quite broad now. There is much more specialized roles inside the in the bigger bucket, and I think that's exciting. That's like any other up and coming, trend. I feel like that's really, really good, because certain people are really good at, visually presenting something. Certain people are really good at writing. Certain people are really good at like taking feedback and like presenting internally, and usually, the goal is to find one person that can do it all. But I think ideally you do find people that can kind of, can specialize and take and make that their own. I think, whoever can go next. Karen, would you want to go next?
Wait, can you repeat the question? I think I know it is, but I want to hear it again.
Yeah, just some of the challenges that you feel that you face, like in your day-to-day, journey in open source, and maybe if you can share a story, of like an experience that had taught you a lot when it comes to, kind of the cons of the job.
Sure. Okay. I guess I'll kind of go back to what I was saying earlier, but the opposite of it. So, kind of working in the open, right? Like, everything you do is very much so transparent. And so I think I won't give too much details, but recently I worked on something, and the rollout of it wasn't necessarily favorable, and it ended up being because like I said, I've been doing open source for like 6 years at this point, but there are new people, right, who join this space, and not everyone is well versed in the ways that we do stuff in open source. And so, without getting too much into it, basically, like, we had someone who was new who didn't necessarily know the ways of doing something, and like, when something rolled out, it kind of like blew back in their face. And so I think like for those of us who do work in open source, like we know what we're doing, but I think sometimes we need to remember that like open source is still kind of a new concept in certain ways, and we need to kind of keep in mind that not everyone quite understands that, right? Because like when this thing kind of played out badly, like so then this other person came through and was just like, what is happening, and like called us out on it, and that was like in their right, but also it's just like keep in mind that there are people new to the space, whether they're younger or just like coming from a different angle. Like remember that like yes, we do try to be transparent and do things in the open, but also keep in mind that like there are new people who are still learning, and that we need to continue to be empathetic even towards people who are just joining, not just the people who are already there. Yeah, I know it's kind of vague. But yeah, like I said earlier, it's like I've been doing this for a while, and even then, like us as a collective team are still learning, or is still learning, and yeah, just stay empathetic and remember what it's like for people who are new to the space.
Absolutely. I mean, there's definitely that like echo chamber that I think we might be part of as well sometimes. Like it just like reinforces us to just think that everyone knows what open source is and how it works and the intricacies of it. And the more you get into it, there's also like drama, like the open source drama. And like there's also like, we all know, like when we talk about it at conferences and stuff, like, there's publications, there's actually like media outlets that would talk about this drama in like articles and so on. And it's so interesting, and so I, talking about media outlets, Daniel, like I know you work for InfoQ.
Yeah, name check someone I work for there.
Yeah. Any experience you have to share within this context?
Yeah, one thing I think I made a mistake personally, and I see it quite a bit, and it echoes some of the things Karen was saying, is don't be afraid when you start in the community to chop wood, carry water. Right? I'm totally borrowing that from the CNCF. I say it a lot. But I remember when I got involved in the OpenJDK, the open source Java project, I was like, right, I'm coding on Java now, right? How can I help? Right? And they were like, oh, could you fix some typos in the docs? And I was like, what? I'm a coder, fixing typos in the docs. Okay, I'll do that. Did that. Can you write some more documentation? I was like, yeah, sure thing. Done that. Like, surely I've earned my stripes. I'm coding in Java now, right? They're like, oh no, would you mind putting some presentations together to bring new people into the OpenJDK community? And I've got to name check my buddy and my partner in crime, Manny Sakar. We literally toured Europe just onboarding folks onto OpenJDK, and it really, I think Cody mentions it made me humble, or Rosemary mentioned it, like so that they're being humble. I was like, you know what? I don't need to be coding in the internals of Java to make a massive impact here, right? Chop wood, carry water, write docs, onboard people. And I think my mentors saw that as my superpower before I did. And as an engineer at heart, I was like, I just want to engineer stuff, right? So I think that was, and I see it like people I mentor now, right? They're like, oh, I want to come on, play with telepresence, I'll do a PR. And I'm like, hey, let's work through the getting started doc first. Any improvements you could suggest for that for me? Hey, would you mind doing some PRs on the docs? And they're like, I don't want to do docs. I'm like, chop wood, carry water, right? Like, and I love the CNCF have got onto this, and they say they even do the chop wood, carry water awards, which I think are fantastic. So mistakes I've made, definitely learn my lesson. Mistakes I see other folks make are around that area. Like everyone can make an impact, but when you're new to community, like Karen said, figure out the lay of the land. Don't just jump in and start creating lots of sort of noise is my advice. Start, chop wood, carry water, start at the bottom, not start at the bottom, but start where folks recommend you to start, because they probably know more than you do, and then follow their advice and so forth, and try and pay it forward.
Absolutely. I think more often it's like the opposite, right? Like you have people that are really like software oriented focused, and like they don't really think about that, hey, like we're writing this really complex piece of software. They've dedicated hours and hours of their own lifetime to like achieve certain feature or like certain product release or whatever. And no one's going to use it because it doesn't have any docs. It doesn't really have like any, way of teaching someone how to use it. And then on the other hand, like as a new contributor, like you come into a project, I think you have a very unique perspective to the project. Like once you join, like you'll drink the Kool-Aid and then it's done. Like you won't have the perspective that you do. So I think it's really important when you join a new team or a new open source project, like look at those like help wanted, tag labels on GitHub, or like good first issue label, and do those. Go through that. It'll teach you about how they deliver the software, how they release it, how the docs are done. All of those things are now integral part of doing open source, and it doesn't. You can't get away with it. You can't not anymore. No, you have to do that in order to be successful. I guess I want to hear what Rosemary has to say when it comes to some of the challenges that she's faced.
I think that a challenge that happens in open source, specifically open source contributors, and by extension, a lot of folks who go into developer relations, is you develop a sense of imposter syndrome after a while. When you go through this process of like, okay, I got recognized for an open source contribution, but it was just for docs. Like, really, does that mean I'm not technical? And then you go through all these doubts in your head, and what sometimes it is exacerbated not by the community itself, by sometimes folks outside of the community that don't really actually have much of a vested interest in it, right? And a lot of folks that I've talked to in open source contribution, in developer relations, software engineers, even infrastructure, operations teams, they do have a sense of doubt, right? Whether or not they're really skilled and truly are supposed to be recognized and are accomplishing something. And I think what we don't really talk about is that this is a challenge that you'll run into when you go into something. You're going to doubt yourself. And in a good open source community, the challenge is having the group of people around this community to bolster you and say, no, don't doubt yourself. Your contributions are valuable. You are accomplishing something that is impacting someone else in this community positively. And having that mechanism and the support is really helpful for maintaining contributors and ultimately getting more people into the project, and onboarding them. I think we don't really talk about it. Some of us say individually, we have some sense of imposter syndrome one way or the other, but I don't think we actually acknowledge that as a community, we probably have more of it than we expect, and we have to have mechanisms to support that.
It never goes away. Like, no matter how much you learn and how much you achieve, like, you always doubt yourself, and you definitely need a support system. I definitely recommend like mentorship programs. I know CNCF does that. I know internally at HashiCorp we do that. I know like other companies like Kong and like Ambassador, like, we all want to mentor people. We want to like, or be mentored in some sense. Because I think it really helps you build that, backbone that you really need in order to survive, to go through, and like not be sitting like 5-6 years later and realizing this is not what you wanted to do, and like all of those thoughts that you usually get. So yeah, it's definitely helpful to have a support group and do some form of like group therapy sessions in terms of like the open source group therapy sessions. And I think what's more interesting is that some of that has been lacking because of course the pandemic. Like, we usually meet at conferences, and this is what we do. We all sit down and talk about like what has gone right, what has gone wrong. And like, I think it really helps shed some of that load that we carry from the year. Hopefully we can, this panel has felt like that. And in terms of like a kind of a closed group therapy session about like open source and so on. All right. So I think those were some of the things that we wanted to discuss today. We have a few audience questions. We'll take a few from the audience. I'll ask Bill, who's very gracefully running the show for us, and for today. I would love for some of the questions to come up. Hey, Bill. So yeah, I think we'll take a few from the audience. I'll quickly go through and check here. Let's see. Let's take Luke's question. Okay, there we go. So what are the most common misconceptions folks have about, DevRel role, like on a day-to-day basis? Anyone can take this one.
That we give a talk a day. Or we're writing a blog a day. That's usually not the case. I hate to burst everyone's bubble, but we're usually prioritizing many other things, like interfacing with product engineering, reverse engineering something that someone in the community has proposed to us and we're not really sure what it is, iterating or innovating on some other glueware that will help. And then, to be honest, most of us prepare the blogs or talks like, a week less than that maybe before we actually present it. So yeah, it's one big misconception I get is that all you do is speak publicly and write blogs.
Maybe on the flight before the conference, maybe an hour before the thing. Sometimes we cut it close. Anyone else wants to talk about this?
I would say that folks think we're non-technical. I think we've covered this on the panel before, but I've definitely had people literally I've been on a Reddit thread and they've gone, oh, this person like pointed at me saying, oh, they're clearly in DevRel because they were never a good enough programmer. And I was like, oh, that sucks. I'm not a great programmer, but like that kind of thing, yeah. So as in like to your point, Rosemary, like often what gets you there when you're then in DevRel, you're more sort of on the teaching aspect of it. So maybe it's not so much like cranking out the code 8 hours a day or whatever, but we're still, most of us are technical, and even if we're not, it's not a big deal, right? It's like they're all different skill sets in my world, whether you can communicate effectively, whether you can code effectively, all these different things. But yeah, that one still gets me sometimes. People like go, oh, you're a marketing person now. I'm like, there's nothing wrong with that, but I'm technical marketing, right? Like to your point, Cody, like I'm cool with that, right?
Absolutely. Anyone else wants to add to that? All right. So we have a few more. So I'll look through this list. Okay, there we go. So there's Bear's question. There we go. As a developer relations lead, what's your working relationship like with product managers? What are some key lessons learned working effectively with them? This is good. So yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think from my experience, it's well, first I think it's interesting because across the industry, some groups have DevRel reported through product management, some have them reported through different chains. There's interesting like reporting structure aspects of that challenge as well. I think that it goes kind of back to where this whole conversation started around how you interact with the community as well as how you interact internally. I think that product managers tend to be very passionate about the thing they're building. They have a vision in their head of the thing that they're building and the way people are going to use it. The use case and the persona studies and all of these things that are like common vendor jargon that we use when we talk about how we build these grand and powerful things. And when you come in from the outside as somebody who's in relations working with the community and somebody's like, hey, I know you think that I'm going to use this tool this way, but in reality, I have a 50-person team that in my organization that uses it a very different way, and we're very successful with that. There's a I don't want to call it a negative friction, but there is a friction that develops between the way people use a product and the way oftentimes a product manager expects it to be used. Really good product managers embrace that, and they have a separate box on their Figma diagram that shows the way the community is consuming this project. Less seasoned product managers go back aggressively and say, this is how they should be using it. Can you tell the community that this is how it's supposed to be? So I think that translation layer I talked about earlier becomes more important in also kind of helping product management along and say, hey, I'm here to help you. And I'm here to tell you the way people are, because they want to use your product. They want to do it. They're invested. So we can either adjust to them and figure out how to balance that out, or we can go aggressively and tell them they're wrong. But I think we know which one of those is not going to work out well. So I think it's a dancing act between being true to the community you're part of, true to yourself, and helping people along inside of the company. It's an interesting balance.
Absolutely. Anyone else?
I sort of have something to add, I think. So I work with several product managers because we have lots of different open source projects. And so one of the things I'm trying to do that I think is working well is like as an example, I'm currently working on like our contributor doc. So like doing a contributing doc and like a contributor ladder file and all that stuff in our projects. And I'm kind of doing this for like multiple projects at once, just in the sense that like if I'm already working on, a framework for one thing, I can reproduce this for like other projects as well, right? And kind of like using a template and doing it across the board. And I think that way it's more of like you can work with multiple PMs at a time, tackling, something that is going to be similar, right? And just like, yeah, I don't know. I like that's just one aspect, and it might be more specific to me because I'm working with multiple PMs at once. But yeah, I think getting things done and like less context switching is easier because I think when you're in at least in my position, it's like, yeah, you're doing like one thing for multiple projects. So you might as well just do them all like at the same time.
Yeah, and then there's something to be said about consistency as well. Like I think that'll just bring in that consistency across the projects. People, if they're contributing to one, will find it very useful to have the same style of contribution for like other projects. It's easily they can switch between them. Hopefully, contributing one will lead to contributing to the others, and I think that's kind of just enables all of that stuff. So it's great.
Can I have one extra thing on that, Mishra? Yeah. Something I thought, riffing off both those comments, I think, is something I've learned in my career is learning to speak the language of the person you're talking to. So when one language I'm using with the community, I think it's probably your translation there, Cody, to be completely honest. I might be just paraphrasing you here, but like, as in, like, apologies if I am, but I do remember like chatting to the community, being authentic, being techie, like, what's your problem? And how can I help? But then a little bit of translation going on with the PM, and just saying, hey, this is how I saw the problem. And to sort of riff on that, I think connecting people, there's nothing like, actually, I've definitely connected PMs and folks in the community before and had a Zoom call, because when you put a face and a voice to the problem, it suddenly gets much more real. You know, if you can't do that, personas are a good thing. I've a lot of success with personas, but actually connecting folks as a kind of archetypal person like in this space. I think some of the like PMs and PM folks I've worked with, they're not used to connecting with the community and giving them that bridge. And we are sort of the bridge. DevRel is kind of the bridge, right? And enabling that and supporting them in that conversation is really powerful too in that translation.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, I think a lot of people are surprised in a positive way when they realize like how, how good, like, it feels to get a direct feedback from someone out there using it. A lot of engineers and product people sometimes never see, a human. They just see something that gets done, especially in larger companies. But it's really, really nice to have that direct link into it. And in some ways, like, they'll actually help you do your developer relations job as well, and make it easier for you. So I think that's really, really useful. All right, I'll move on to the next question. The one from Greg that says, "What type of person would be there we go, would be a bad fit / unhappy in DevRel role?" This is an interesting one. Yeah, I would love for thoughts on this.
I would probably say someone who likes a lot of structure probably would be pretty unhappy in a DevRel role. I'm not saying that not all DevRel teams universally don't have structure, but when you're cross-functional in this manner, you have to pivot really quickly. So you have to be someone who understands there's a strategy in mind from an open source standpoint, or any product standpoint, tool standpoint, whatever you decide, and you have to pivot tactically based on whatever like comes in your queue. And so if you're someone who enjoys a ton of structure, like sort of like estimations, the methodology, it might not be the greatest kind of fit, because sometimes it's a little bit chaotic, for lack of a better word.
I just had, I think that's perfect, Rosemary. Yeah, I 100% agree with what you're saying there. And if words like "it's easy," "why don't you understand" are in your vocabulary, that's a bad sign as well. I've worked with some ridiculously smart engineers, love them to bits, amazing people. But like, I ask them, like, "How do you do that?" "Oh, it's easy." I'm like, "It's really not." Yeah. So folks that, like, again, everyone's got their sort of place, finding their place. But I think if you can't empathize with people, and you just keep going like, what, that's probably a bad sign for DevRel, right? Good for engineering, good for many other places, but I think you have to be patient, and you have to like literally understand the problem from the other person's position rather than your own.
That's it. Well, I have something to add. When it comes to like people who, I think I on a serious note, I agree with what Rosemary said for sure. Like, if you do want that traditional like release per release delivery, software thing, then I think this is it's a difficult role. I think because it's so dynamic in nature, like things in the market change, like especially if you're working for a vendor, They might be a theme that might get popular really quickly, or a technology that might get popular really quickly, and you have to adapt as a company. And vendors do that every day. The ones that do it really well are the ones that are still in the market, and the same thing has to be done on the developer relations function, where you end up doing that. You end up pivoting, and I think, and also like the reality of the world. For example, like a really good example is what happened with COVID, right? We lost all the conferences that we did in person, so a lot of like ways of connecting the community are gone. And we relied on a lot of these conferences to bring in or do a release or do a big announcement or get a lot of feedback in on a certain really core feature to your business. You no longer can do that. Luckily, I think a lot of developer relations functions were able to seamlessly pivot. And even though it looks seamless for people outside, but internally it's chaos, right? Because we're trying to figure it out. But I think we were able to do that. We were able to do online events. We were able to do do more content online via live streams and discussions like these and so on to get the word out there. So I think, things do change. And if that brings in some, you don't agree with it, or it's too much for you when these things happen and you have to change quickly, I think it's going to be a challenge for you to learn that. And context switching, like for sure, I think, especially if you're company like, for example, Microsoft or Kong or like Ambassador and HashiCorp, like that have multiple products in the portfolio, you have to switch context quite a lot. Even though you might focus on one project or product, there's often like things that are cross product, and you have to switch things quite quickly. A lot of people don't like that type of context switch. They like to work on one project for 2 years, and that's what they want to do. And so I think those are the things that you need to really think about.
Can I add to this? So I mean, I think that there are some things that you about yourself that you might not necessarily be able to change that would make you feel like you're not a good fit for DevRel. But I think there are other things like maybe public speaking, like maybe you don't like doing that, right? And you automatically be like, oh, well, this isn't the role for me. Like, I think there are some things that you can learn. I actually don't like public speaking either, but I've gotten better at it over time just from practice, right? And like writing, you can always get better at writing. So there are elements that you can improve on, you can get better at. And with that, like I would say, like, don't rule these things out for yourself just because you might not be as good at it as you want to be yet. Yeah.
Can I add something to Karen's comments? I have something that kind of ties into that well. I think that there's empathy is a double-edged sword. I think the best DevRel people are very empathetic people, but that empathy is usually like a symptom of being a fairly emotional person, or a person who carries a fair amount of emotion with themselves. And knowing yourself is very important. Knowing the times where you're going to like carry that burden of community, because there are times where it is a burden, and that sounds like a very negative thing to say, and it's not. It's a very magical and positive thing. But when you get a long chain of negative feedback on a thing, that weighs on that empathetic part of your soul. And if you're not honest with yourself enough to know when you need to have those conversations with peers to say, hey, I need some reinforcement. It was a rough week. I got beat up pretty bad, and I don't feel like I don't feel like I can do DevRel because this hurt me a lot more than I expected it to. Know thyself, right? That's a quote that goes around a lot. I think that it's not a matter of being a bad fit or unhappy, but if you're on the journey and you're not willing to admit that you're still figuring out who you are and those emotional sides of yourself and how to wield them and how to use them, it's going to be a challenge until you're willing to say you need help with that, or to come to a community and or a group of peers and be open about that. Being emotional is fine. I am probably one of the most emotional people I know. But I would have a much harder job in this space if I wasn't willing to come to terms with that. And if I bottled that all up and I contained that and I didn't share that out and I stuffed that down, I would be quitting already. Right? Like I would be gone because, but ultimately the ability to have those conversations and know that I am that way. I think that the best DevRel people, and frankly, the best technologists, are able to understand their emotions, how to wield them, how to use them for good, and then when to blow them off with people that you trust and that you know will support you as part of that internal community as well, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. It's definitely you need to learn how to take a step back, like from all of this. Like, especially in public facing roles, it's very difficult to, you just can't function. So it's better to just take a step back, share, and like come back fresh. But we'll take I know we are almost at time. Let's quickly take a last question, which is Ashley's question here. It says, okay, so what's the most valuable overlap that DevRel has with other departments, and how can other departments in the org support / learn from DevRel? So we'll give quick answers on this one.
So I start and say, I think the most valuable overlap is the bridge to the customer, or that's probably sounding a bit sort of rephrase that, the bridge to the community. I think that's often under-emphasized in roles I've seen. So like we can be that translation there. We've mentioned this a few times, but we can, we're thinking of building this part and do the product. Is it really a problem for the community? Actually, going out to the community and finding what the problems are and bring them in. So I think a lot of the superpowers are being the bridge between the customers, the communities, the developers, call it what you will, and the business. I think that's really important. And for me, I learn a lot from my support team, or the support team in Ambassador Labs. They're amazing people, super smart, real close customer interactions, and there's so much synergy there between the community and customers, right? And I think in that same notion around sales engineering, some folks do look at sales, kind of, like same deal, right? As in not technical or whatever. But I've learned so much from the sales engineering team of problems they've encountered, solutions they've come up with. They have a real pulse on the customers, and I've probably got more of a pulse on the community. And between the two of us, we learn a lot of really cool stuff. Because some folks, their customers will never be in the community, and vice versa. And you've got to look both ears, right? And DevRel and Sales Eng, I think, are quite complementary in that respect. So that's probably more from just to frame it, more from a startup type background. That's where I spend a lot of my time. Probably different in bigger orgs. But yeah, that's my advice, is with the connecting in with the other closely related departments.
Cool. I think we're at time. I'm really sorry. I think this is, I don't want to go over. It's quite bad. I know you all are super busy. I really appreciate you all making this time. This is a substantial amount of time on a topic that I think we should, share more. And I felt that this is a really good conversation where we're able to touch like different portions of open source and DevRel. I really appreciate each one of you, and thank you for your contributions in your own communities. So I really, really appreciate that. And yeah, I think I appreciate, I'm really thankful to commit to hosting this and having us discuss this, something that I think should be discussed more. They are, by the way, just a quick shout out, they are hiring a DevRel person now. So please, okay, there we go. That's the link. So check that link out. Super easy to get to that link. This is Commit Advocate in Bitly. And yeah, if you're interested, you can apply there. All right. Thank you so much, everyone. I appreciate it.
Thanks.
Stay safe. Bye-bye.